Hello and welcome to another edition of the Hopgood Hour, my monthly cable news show that brings the people of the 8th District news and views from Lansing. I'm State Senator Hoon-Yung Hopgood, and as always, please feel free to contact my office with any questions or concerns that you may have regarding state government or any issues of concern. Please feel free to write us, email us, or give us a phone call. I'm very pleased today to be joined by State Senator Gretchen Whitmer, who represents the Lansing area and is also the leader of the Democratic caucus in the Senate. And we're going to be talking about the governor's State of the State speech, some of the Senate Democratic priorities, and the upcoming state budget that we'll be working on this spring. So welcome to today's show. Thank you very much for being on. Why don't you just start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
All right, well, it's always good to be with you. I've had the pleasure of being on your show before, and I always enjoy the opportunity to talk about issues so that your constituents can learn a little bit more about some of the things that are happening here. You know, you started with talking about the state of the state, and in this era of term limits, you know, there are so many legislators in and out of here so quickly. Not many get the chance to have such amass such experience as you have, and as I have. I've been very lucky to have been elected. This is my second full term in the Senate, so that means this was the 14th state of the state that I have been to, served with 3 different governors, and, you know, like you and your constituents, you know, I came here with a charge from the people that I represent to fight for education. And representing East Lansing, I've got Michigan State University in my district, as well as a lot of great public schools, and education really, I think, is the paramount concern for the people that I represent, and that's why, as we'll talk about the state of the state, we'll talk a little bit about, you know, some of the education initiatives or some of the statements that the governor made, and I think that'll be probably as interesting to your constituents as they would be to mine. But like I said, it's my 14th year in the legislature. It's been a privilege to have served, and I think we've got a big year ahead of us.
Well, you've been around for a little bit, like you said, and you've heard from, this is now your 3rd governor, and you probably heard some variation of every different story or tale that you can imagine. And so, you know, the governor made a point, I think, in his State of the State speech to talk about education. And what was your reaction to that? He talked about education funding in particular. What was your assessment of that part of the speech?
Well, one of the things that I was really surprised, you know, in 14 states of the state, I don't think there's ever been one before where a governor didn't spend some time talking about higher education. And in this last week's State of the State, Governor Snyder mentioned one university in the UP and some things that they were doing. But really, there was no real discussion about the importance of and the need for to ensure that higher education is attainable for everyone in the state. You know, that there is not this massive financial burden that precludes so many people from even seeking that degree that they need. But in terms of what he did say on education, he did talk about the per pupil foundation allowance. And I think, in my estimation, he took some liberties with regard to spinning what has happened in the state budget. When the governor was first elected, and you being on education committees are acutely aware, and you're our expert on education for the caucus, but in his budget in the very first year, he proposed and signed into law a $470 per pupil cut for our schools, for our kids. Why did he do it? Well, it was not because there was a shortfall in the school aid fund. To the contrary, there actually was quite a bit of money in the school aid fund. We could have made a greater investment in our kids' schools, but Governor Snyder chose instead to take money out of the school aid fund in order to backfill the general fund and to give a big corporate tax break. And so over the years since then, he did at one point put $30 increase into per pupil funding, which brings his net cut down to $440 per pupil for all of our kids. But in his State of the State, he said he'd put $660 into per pupil funding, and that's just not true. The truth is, we as a state have a legal obligation to put certain amount of dollars into the retirement system. He's counted every dollar that has gone into the retirement system and divided it by the number of students and called that a per pupil increase. That's not at all true. When you talk about per pupil funding, you're supposed to be talking about dollars that are actually going into the classroom. Well, any parent like you, Senator Hopgood, or me, I'm actually in the public schools every day with my girls, and I'll tell you, any parent who goes into a school knows those dollars did not go into the classroom. Our classes have been hit, and hit hard, to balance the state budget and pay for corporate tax breaks. And that's not something that we're going to stand for. We're going to continue to fight to make that an investment, because we know education investment is economic development. It's the best economic development you can have if you're a state that desperately needs jobs and investment. Education's the best way to do that.
So you think that maybe what's happening out in the real world, what's happening in our communities, really isn't reflected in what the governor's talking about in terms of what he's talking about with education?
Yeah, I think, the governor is, he's a parent who's got his kids in a private school, and I don't begrudge him that. That's his choice, and parents, if they can afford to make those kind of choices, and we know he can, that's his choice. But it doesn't mean that every one of us who has kids in public schools or grandkids in public schools should balance the budget at the expense of our own children's education. And so when he stands up and says there's been an increase of $660 per pupil, that's flat out wrong. And any superintendent across the state, any teacher across the state, any parent across the state can see it every single day in our schools, that that's not true. And I think it's unconscionable to try to tell people that you're helping school kids because you've made this legally required payment into a retirement system. Those dollars don't go into the classroom, and it's not honest to tell people that they did.
It's a claim that seems to ring hollow when you talk about 2 entire school districts being dissolved, when you talk about the fact that the state of Michigan is experiencing a record number of deficit districts. I mean, just, you can hear the words over here, but you can use your eyes and ears and actually see what's happening out in the real world, and that's not necessarily matching up. We have had some discussion in Lansing and around the state about the state budget and having a surplus. Can you talk about that and maybe what some people have been talking about in terms of what we do with the surplus and maybe some ideas that you might have?
Sure. Well, with regard to the surplus, so we recently had our revenue estimating conference, which is where we have economists from the Senate, from the House, and from Treasury. They come together and they've got outside economists come in and tell us what they project in terms of revenue for the state. We are closing our books. We see that at the end of last year, there was money that was not expended. It's $917 million. 1/3 of that, roughly, came from the school aid fund, and 2/3 came from the general fund. And so we hear a lot of people around town talking about this surplus. But I would submit that surplus sounds like extra money, right? I would submit, though, that those dollars were dollars that were wrongfully taken out of our schools, or should not have been taxed from our pensioners, or perhaps it was an earned income tax credit that should not have been ratcheted down so far. These are dollars that were expended toward our workers or our seniors or our kids' education that they took too much of, and now they've got a leftover balance. So when we watched the governor give his State of the State, we heard our Republican colleagues, praise themselves for good governance. We know the truth is there wouldn't be that $900 million there if our colleagues hadn't pushed through a pension tax, cuts to education, and a cut to the earned income tax credit for working families who are on the bubble. So in terms of how those dollars should be expended, I would submit that those dollars should go right back where they were taken from, and that is out of our schools, the school aid fund.
You mentioned the cuts to schools and education from a couple years ago, but we are still diverting dollars from the school aid fund and using it for other purposes. Is that correct?
That's true. And you know, one of the things I think that really surprises people when we kind of get into all the details here is, you know, when Proposal A was passed, one of the foundation of the argument was that these dollars would be protected and they would go only to our neighborhood schools. That was a big part of the advertisement campaign, a big part of the argument in favor of adopting Proposal A when it was on the ballot. And the voters really believed that by adopting Proposal A, they were going to ensure that their taxpayer dollars were going to go to those neighborhood schools. It was property tax that needed to stay in with the schools. So and this started under the last administration, but when dollars started coming out of the school aid fund, people really felt that they had been, you know, lied to during that campaign, that these dollars were supposed to go to our schools and now they're going to be used to backfill the general fund. So taking them out of our schools and sending over there. Unfortunately, the governor and his lawyers have said, well, this isn't unconstitutional. Well, it might not be unconstitutional for them to move it over to higher education, to rob Peter to pay Paul, but it's not right. It doesn't make it right. And so we've proposed constitutionally protecting all those property taxes for K-12 education, which is exactly what the spirit of Proposal A was. It's unfortunate that we have to try to fight to ensure that the promise is kept, but that's where we're at right now. The Snyder administration continues to take more money out of school aid fund so that they can move money around in the general fund.
Another topic that the governor talked a little bit about was seniors, and you mentioned the pension tax. I thought it was interesting that he talked about seniors and Meals on Wheels. I just got something in my office that said that the governor's changes to the tax code that affected seniors cost our seniors about $650 million each and every year. Can you talk about that in terms of what the governor talked about in the State of the State speech, and you know, maybe what those tax changes have meant in our communities?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I think kind of the overarching theme of the State of the State was re-election 2014. I think the governor's done some polling. I think he's gotten some feedback from the what his agenda's been for the first 3 years of this term, and I think he's learned that people are not happy about what's happened in terms of education. I think that he learned he's going to have a big problem with seniors and voters who care about seniors' issues. When they proposed and pushed through the pension tax, that is something that we fought as, you know, as a caucus together, fought against the Republican pension tax. And I remember when that came out that they were going to push that, how surprised we were after all the anti-tax pledges the Republicans have taken and all of the rhetoric. To push through a tax on our seniors was just so surprising. But it has real effects on people. You know, pensions, when people retire and they do their calculation in terms of how they are going to go on living beyond the weekly paycheck, those pensions are the sole source of income for so many people. And they've calculated down to the penny almost whether or not they can afford to retire. These are also a population that isn't going to go out and get a part-time job to supplement their income when they are retirement age and have spent their whole life working and saving and doing the right thing. And so this pension tax that the Republicans pushed through, I think, has really come with a great political cost. And so when the governor talked about seniors in his State of the State, I think it was less about the reinvention of Michigan, but more about the reinvention of the record, of the Republican record with regard to our seniors. We are all glad to see a valuable program like Meals on Wheels get some time in the State of the State and to get an infusion of support, and that's a great thing. But it doesn't undo the harm that this, that our colleagues did to seniors when they pushed through that pension tax. I think they've got a lot more work to do if they're going to try to really do something credible on behalf of seniors, and I think the best thing they could do would be repeal the Republican pension tax.
I think that one of the big issues that the governor did talk about, and that is certainly, in addition to education and seniors, the economy is definitely something that's on the people back home, their minds, in terms of how the economy's doing, what the state has done in terms of trying to support the economy. And again, certainly that was something that the governor talked about. What was your impression and reaction to that?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about the first few states of the state that Governor Snyder had given, and in particular his speech on his inauguration. I went to his inauguration on that cold day in January 3 years ago, and he said a lot of great things, a lot of things that I was really encouraged to hear. Like, we are going to move all of Michigan forward and leave no one behind. Job one is jobs. We heard that a number of times throughout that first couple months that he had taken office. And yet we know that our unemployment rate is still the third highest in the nation. It did just take a small step in the right direction, which we are all pleased to see. But I think that when you have such a high unemployment rate, progress is one thing, but when you compare where Michigan is compared to all the other states, we are not moving forward fast enough. And we certainly aren't moving forward fast enough for all the unemployed people who are desperately need work in the state of Michigan. I read one statistic that said the quickest growing job sector right now in Michigan is fast food. I think that is such a terrible thing to, such a terrible thing to learn. I want Michigan, you want Michigan, we want Michigan to be the fastest growing sector in IT jobs or the new creative class. And we know that the best thing that you can do is to give people the education that they need to do those jobs and to start that business and to be entrepreneurs. That's why we introduced the Michigan 2020 plan, and we're going to continue to push that because every economist will tell you the most important factor in any business deciding where to locate is not tax structure, it's not roads, it's not even public safety. It's having the workforce to do the jobs that you need. And so that's why we are going to continue to push along those lines because I do believe that jobs should be job one. And education's the best thing that we can do to ensure that we bring jobs back to Michigan.
One of the things that the governor did talk about in the State of the State speech, and it was actually one of his longer speeches, but he did talk about, and he gave credit to Democrats, and that was interesting in terms of Medicaid expansion. So that was a big thing that the legislature worked on over the last year or whatnot. Can you talk about that issue? I mean, it was good to see him talk about that and to, I guess, extend credit where credit is due. Can you tell us about that?
Certainly. Well, that is one example where we really did work well with the governor. And and even the House Republicans. I think that we had a unique opportunity where our governor saw the wisdom of expanding Medicaid in Michigan, not just because financially there was a big benefit to everyone in our state, and I mean everyone, not just people who are covered by the expansion, but everyone who's lucky enough to have that health care card that they use every day now subsidizes uncompensated care less. So it's actually a benefit to every single person in Michigan, and the governor saw that. He also, I believe, saw that it was the right thing to do in terms of taking care of our people who most need support and help. And so it was nice to be able to work with the administration on something that we saw eye to eye on. Unfortunately, the biggest hurdle was in the chamber that we serve in the state Senate, and ironically, it was with the governor's own party that kept him from getting immediate effect on the bill. And immediate effect means that instead of waiting for a bill to go into effect as soon as the governor signs it, that it has to wait until the end of session and then 90 days beyond that. And so when you don't give a bill like Medicaid expansion immediate effect, there is a big cost associated with that. The governor was short by 2 votes. He couldn't get 2 Republicans to vote to give it immediate effect. A vote which you and I know they often say is just a procedural vote, but they wouldn't do it on political grounds. And unfortunately, the cost of that is that we've got people who don't have the expanded coverage yet, who are still suffering, and they have to pay a penalty because of it. And then you add into the fact that we are foregoing $7 million every day that we don't have Medicaid expanded in Michigan. So it's going to have a real cost to us as a state of, in total, by the time this bill goes into effect, $630 million, which is an enormous sum of money when you're talking about foregone opportunities, taking care of our people, education. You could even talk about roads. We could talk about all sorts of priorities that we could have taken a look at and invested in that we can't because the governor couldn't get 2 votes out of the Michigan Senate.
So the impact in our communities is going to be pretty significant. It's going to be definitely felt in the bigger piece of this. But there is a part that comes right back directly to the state government and the budget. Isn't that correct? Because we anticipated giving it immediate effect. We anticipated it starting right at the start of the new year, and that delay actually affects other parts of the budget.
Well, that's exactly right, and that was another point, I think, with regard to the state of the state. I thought it was sadly ironic when the governor said he was going to endorse a balanced budget amendment to be sent to Congress because they should learn to balance their books like we do. But we know our books are not balanced. One of the reasons is, there are 2 reasons, but one of them, which is what you just pointed out, is by not giving Medicaid expansion immediate effect, they've got a hole in the state budget of $70 million for not doing that. And then you add in the fact that the governor's claims tax predictions were way off. That's another $130 million. So the governor's current year budget, not next year's budget, but this budget is $200 million short just by virtue of those 2 issues. And so it was kind of hard to watch with a straight face when they were all claiming that they've got a balanced budget, because we know for a fact that their budget is not balanced yet.
So we'll have to adjust that as we move along, and should probably resolve that before we even think real seriously about next year's budget. I mean, you take care of this year's budget, and then you worry about next year's budget. Is that a fair thing to say?
That would seem to be the rational way to do things. It has yet to be seen whether or not that's how we will move forward. I believe when the governor gives his budget presentation on February 5th, he will address both the current year deficit as well as the budget he's proposing for the next fiscal year.
So I think that you probably talked about a little bit of this, but looking at 2014, looking forward to the legislative year, what are some of the Senate Democratic priorities? What are some of the things that we would like to see done, addressed in the legislature and in the state?
Well, I think in terms of, 2014 or 2013 or 2012, our fundamental platform doesn't change just because it's an election year. We're going to continue to fight for education funding, education reforms that make sense, not that are punitive or have political agendas, but if there's something on the table that is really about assessing and ensuring that what happens in the classroom is productive and worthy and a strong program for our kids, those are things that we can find value in, to be certain. But to ensure that our kids are not shortchanged in the classroom, that taxpayers are getting real value for the dollars that they are assessed and give to state government, that we are good stewards of taxpayer dollars. I think that the Michigan 2020 plan with regard to as a real jobs initiative is something that we're going to continue to push and deserves to have a full and transparent debate. I think that it's really exciting. If we could take what's happened in Kalamazoo and make that available to all 83 counties in the state, it would be a dramatically different state. And so that's something we're going to continue to push as well. And obviously there are many other issues. On the jobs front, when the Republicans took unemployment down to 20 weeks from 26, I think that's a fight that I still think is worth waging on behalf of working people and people who aren't working, more importantly, in the state. And there are a lot of transportation issues that I know a number of us would really like to see if there's a way of resolving. It's an enormous problem, long-term problem that is going to take, serious people to sit down and see if we can figure out how to solve that one. But I think that's something that we are interested in being a part of.
Well, thank you for being on today's show.
Thank you, Senator Hopgood. It's always good to be with you.
Once again, this has been the Hopgood Hour, and I've been joined by Senator Gretchen Whitmer, the leader of the Democratic caucus in the Michigan Senate, and we've been talking about the start of the year and the state budget and some important issues that we're going to be tackling in the year 2014. Thank you for tuning in. As always, please feel free to contact my office with any questions or concerns that you have. And once again, I'm State Senator Hoon-Yung Hopgood.